So maybe we'll start just a couple minutes about us. Jeff and I have been working together for years now. I'm with Wheatland Spring Farm and Brewery out of Waterford, Virginia, about an hour west of here. We are a 30-acre estate brewery. What that means is the majority of our acreage is dedicated to growing grain for our beer. And so we select specific grains to make specific beers. Most of the beer in the United States and the world is made from commodity barley. There's probably 6 to 12 types of commodity barley that exist in the United States, and those are what's grown for just about every brewery. The stuff we grow is just for our beer. So we get to hand select which types of barley, which types of wheat, which types of triticale we grow. Any other grains that we want to put in the ground, we get to choose what they are for the beers that we're making. We're also regenerative. We don't use any pesticides, chemicals, no glyphosate, none of that stuff hits our farm. We do intensive cover cropping, and we use natural amendments in the soil. We're a relatively small brewery, but we're the size we want to be. We're not trying to take over the world. We don't need to have massive volume, which is the trend that's happening in brewing right now. You're seeing more go out, but I'm convinced there's a finite path you can travel with that before you just get not just saturated but oversaturated. We've been at it for now 5 years growing grain, so half a decade grain in the ground, and 4 years brewing beer. Couldn't do it without this guy. Even before we had grain in the ground, Jeff and I were talking about different types of grains to go in, approaching it, and then we'll get into this in a minute, but all the growing and harvesting is a chunk of the work, but a lot of the work comes after that, when you have to actually deal with the grain, and then it has to come back in, and then you brew with that grain. So there's a lot we can talk about here. It's super helpful to understand where people are coming from and what you might want to learn about, because we can take this in many different directions. What I'd ask is, if you have those questions about something, maybe just wait until like the next chapter hits, and so we can kind of hit it, because we might answer those questions as we go along. But we also have Q&A at the end of this, so we can get plenty of dialogue there. So I'm going to kick it over to you now.
All right. I am Jeff Bloem. I am the founder of Murphy and Rood Malting Company in Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm also on the board of CGA in the position of a humble treasurer, which is also keeping me very busy. But so I opened up Murphy and Rood Malting very early 2018. We moved into our building about mid 2017. 2 months of build out quickly turned into 6. So it took us a little bit to build up. We really, for all intents and purposes, are built from the ground up. We're malting, particularly craft malting, if you will, is right now essentially in the 1990s of craft beer. So if you think back to like 92 when Sierra Nevada was like, everyone's like, what's this pale ale in the green bottle? And you fast forward to now, we are just kind of beginning the churn of craft malting. And so we don't have equipment manufacturers, we don't have turnkey suppliers, so on and so forth. So we build our stuff based on how we frankly plan to move material through the malt house. So all to say that it took a little bit to get going, but we opened at a fairly modest 120 malt tons a year, which when I first opened up was obviously a large hill to try to climb in terms of sales and marketing and customer buying and so forth. We did recently just expand just inside 5 years to just short of triple. So we're about 320-ish malt tons per year. So to give you a sense of the economy of scale here, when we are talking about, and we might be able to, go back. In the world of commodity malting, which is one of the missions of Murphy and Rood Malting, is really to decommoditize the malting space. We use as a raw material something that is very much a commodity, which to me is also not a commodity, but the brewing and distilling world view malted grain as the commodity that it was manufactured from. And we wholeheartedly think that needs to change. By definition, commodity would be you can buy it from anywhere. It's always the same stuff. It's all interchangeable. It's kind of nameless. And really where it came from or how it was made is irrelevant. And we could not disagree more. And so we are very much on a mission to bring some identity to this space and kind of pull back the curtain to see how things were made. And so as an economy of scale thing, if you look at the major malt houses, I'd say they're all consolidating as we speak, but I'd say about 4 primary malting companies, conglomerates, which are all equity-owned, multinational corporations, supply about 90-ish% of the malt across the world. At the probably average batch size of about 400 tons, when I first opened, it would take me almost 4 years to produce what a major malt house would produce in 7 days. And so when we started our expansion, we nearly tripled in size. We can now produce in roughly a year-ish about what it takes, what a large malt house would produce in 7 days. And so as you can imagine, these big malt houses are oftentimes selling malted products at the price that I buy grain for, prior to all of the expenses that go into actually doing that. And so we entered very much a commodity-ridden space. And we had to change our thinking, and we had to actually very truly believe in it in order to make the customer connections. And so that's really what we had, I feel like we've been relatively successful. We'll kind of talk about what's involved in doing that as part of this discussion. And so we hope it's certainly valuable to you all. But I would like to couch it just briefly, and I'll speak for myself, and this is, knowing John, I believe I speak for both of us, when I say that we are kind of speaking to the underworld of brewing and distilling. So if you look at the brewing and distilling world, hundreds of billions of dollars a year. For the vast majority of those producers, they're not my customer. So I look at the brewing world at a much smaller microscopic lens. And so that's really what we're talking about, because frankly, that's kind of where we need to start. No matter what your operation is, it's where you go from there that's important. But so I'm going to be speaking at a much more granular, kind of local, regional level, as opposed to national grocery store shelf brewing and distilling. So just as a bit of a perspective.
All right.
I can just walk through this. So just a quick overview of our plan of attack. John and I will kind of give you a brief look at the current landscape of malting, brewing, and distilling in general. And then we'll talk about really why we're talking about this now, because we really do believe the time is now to really start integrating local and regional grains into the, frankly, pretty vanilla world of craft beverages. And then we'll talk about the viability of brewing grains in the Mid-Atlantic. There's a argument that it may or may not be actually viable. Mostly those that say that's not viable are kind of looking at it from a 30,000 foot level, whereas we are in the trenches of it and can tell you that it very much is viable, just knowing your customer and knowing the industry and community you're in. And then we'll talk briefly about what it takes. We're not going to get probably into the weeds there. That could be another conversation we talk to for days and days. And then we'll open it up to questions. Anything to add to that?
Sounds good.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, is this me? All right. I'm not sure you can see this,
Sorry.
but what it's trying to convey is how things are done now with most beer. So I think you cited 90%, I've heard 99%. The vast majority of beer in America is made from commodity ingredients or origins of Pacific Northwest for hops, and the Dakotas for grain, and you can go to Chicago for yeast, and you get your municipal water for everything else, and you can change the water to make it whatever you want. So an IPA made in New York City is identical to an IPA made in Los Angeles, made in Chicago. It's de-regionalized the beverage. A lot of reasons why this has happened, a lot of reasons that it makes sense over the years. But when I think about local beer, I think about local ingredients. The same way if someone offers me local cheese and it's made from milk from California, I scratch my head and say, you assembled it here maybe, but this is not local cheese. So for us, the approach is very much to focus on what we can grow on our property, which is grain, and we grow some herbs and some other things. What we can't get from our own farm, we start to build the concentric circles out. So there's a farming community around us, and we source from them, and then we keep going. And it's always with a lens to find the producers who share our approach to farming and to sustainability. And so we're able to do that. We pay a lot more for our ingredients, but we sleep fine at night. We don't cut corners on any of these things because we believe, for us, similar to Jeff, this is a deep conviction that we have. We sometimes joke, but it's a serious comment too. It's all about the beer, but it's not about the beer at all. And so it's about making something real, trying to build some sort of social fabric around food and beverage. I spent a bunch of time living in Europe, primarily Germany and Austria, and one of the big takeaways for me was a lot of the culture there is based around their food and drink. It doesn't matter where you are, you can go anywhere, and they all have their own cultures there. When we came back stateside, you certainly have that in some spots, but it's nowhere near as prevalent. And we thought it was such a wonderful, beautiful thing to have, and people come around bread and beer and wine to have those experiences. So this is in big part why we're doing what we do. This is not for the riches. This is not for the fame. This is something that we feel strongly about in order to, we call it growing a new tradition. So right now, it's really easy to click a button on a computer and get your malt delivered to any brewery. That's simple. What I like so much about the relationship that Jeff and I have is we're texting all the time. We're on the phone all the time. When he's in the area, he stays at my house. It's a very different kind of interaction and relationship than you would have with a commodity ingredient, with all the additional time, but all the additional benefits you have of that. And so you get to know who these people are with the single biggest ingredient in your product. And now it's gotten to the point after half a decade of this, I don't know how you make beer without knowing your maltster. I don't understand how that works. Because if they can't tell you what's going on with this, how it was malted, this one was a little bit finicky, you're gonna have to look out for this, or like, here's how you think about this. I don't know how you make an excellent beer without understanding the ingredients that go into it. So malt is there. We also have local yeast. We brew with yeast that we captured in our fields for all of our farmhouse ales and some other ales as well. Our water comes from a natural aquifer below our fields. And we also brew with herbs. We make gruits and other botanicals. The one thing yet we're waiting for are hops. We can have a whole separate session on hops, but if we were to grow hops on our property, I'm convinced they would be just fine, but we'd have to implement a lot more chemicals, so we'd have to change our entire approach to farming, so we're not interested in doing that at this point. There are some new cultivars coming into Virginia. There's some ones that have been found. They're coming back. I think Maryland also has something similar, but research takes about 10 to 15 years, just like it does for grain, to bring those to life. And so my expectation and hope is that in the next decade or so, we're actually going to have some local hops that we can use to make local beer. And we call that land beer, which is a nod to a tradition they have in northern Bavaria, where you source your ingredients from your neighbors, because that's what's available. So that's not what's happening now, though. What's happening now is that everything is disconnected. The supply chains are huge. You still get most breweries buying barley from Europe and all the CO2 that comes along with every mile of that supply chain. Same thing on the West Coast. They bring all that barley over to the East Coast. with the goal of making a consistent beer. I don't know about you all, but I don't remember the last time I drank a beer and said, wow, this is consistent. Who cares? For me, that's not craft. For me, that's a macro consideration. For craft, I want it interesting, I want it dynamic, I want it flavorful, I want it to have an identity to it. And that comes from these kind of relationships where you have, Jeff knows all the farmers, I know most of the farmers as well because of I farm and brew, but Jeff has all these relationships and he knows he's getting the highest quality ingredients and he knows how to malt exceptional barley exceptionally well. And then it turns to us and then we have to do something with it. But we have a much better shot at making a differentiated product and a higher quality product when you have much better ingredients going into it. All right, why don't you take over for this one, give it the malt spin.
Yeah, and so if you briefly go back to this previous slide, it's important, whether you are a grower, a brewer, a distiller, a consumer advocate of craft beverage, you can be part of the solution of all of these things. It's really not that, I mean, these are not terribly difficult problems to solve if you know what they are. I think oftentimes we get caught up in the moment of where we are and have forgotten kind of what is going on behind the curtain. And so I'm gonna paint just a kind of a brief picture of how things work now, particularly in the sourcing side of things, in the craft beverage production side of things. And so that previous slide, those were just malt houses. And frankly, all of those dots were 4 different companies. They just have multiple malt house locations. So those were not the number of individual independent malt houses across the country. Those are, and frankly, consolidating down to probably 2 or 3 relatively soon. But those are just the malt houses. Pretty much all of the malt that is coming out of those malt houses are being solely distributed through national distributors. An added point to that is that the malt houses own the distribution companies. So BSG is owned by RAR Malting. Country Malt is owned by Great Western Malting, which is now been recently purchased by United Malt, who just now sold to Bort Malt. So they are all being consumed. We are now back into the big ag problem of the Monsantos of the world is now becoming kind of the malt of the world here soon. And so they're pushing through mainly 2 to 3 national distributors, BSG, Country Malt, and then LD Carlson. There's a couple small other folks around. But what's important to note is that producers don't just buy their malt from these distributors. They buy their yeast. They have other choices, obviously, but the distributors capture their business based on convenience. So they can purchase malt, raw grain, yeast, hops, cleaning chemicals, sanitation chemicals, all you would need to actually run your given brewery. And so these distributors have kind of become the one-stop shop for what I would call unconscious sourcing in this country. We all just kind of robotically and habitually click the button, I need this and this and this. They've built single pallet minimums so that if you need to buy one 5-gallon jug of caustic to clean your tanks, you need to top it off with 2,000 pounds of malt to make the shipping worth it, right? And so they've inherently kind of just cut me out of the entire purchasing ecosystem. And so that is what we as the the ingredient producers in this commodity world are dealing with, is that we're dealing with a distribution network that is built by the people that are making the main ingredients. And so they've gotten very, very, very good at indirectly being somewhat anti-competitive. So I'm not saying that they're out there going, we're going to figure out a way to keep everybody from buying from these small guys, but they kind of are. And so a good example is of one of the larger breweries in Virginia, based down by me in Charlottesville. they would love to use our malt. And they use our malts fairly often, but they would love to use it a lot more. And we opened as a specialty malt house. So knowing that I'd be fighting against commodity pricing, we focused on higher margin, lower volume specialty malts. It's things that consumers can see and taste and smell in their beer, and allows brewers and distillers, or in this case brewers, to stick to their margin busting commodity base malts, but then utilize local grain in the specialty malt side of things to pack more punch in their given beer. They can't use our specialty malts because their base malt price is tied to the fact that they buy all of their specialty malts from the same company. So they are more or less handcuffed to their malt supplier because their entire pricing scenario is based on what, not even so much how much they buy, but what they buy. And so we are working within the mold of that. Again, commodity pricing, I oftentimes am paying roughly, the average bushel's gone up. I think I'm anywhere between $10 and $13 a bushel for barley right now. Oh, Jesus. Okay. And so we are buying grain for roughly the same price that these big malt houses are selling to. So you're fighting up against very, very cheap pricing, habitual ordering. People just don't want to think about doing it a different way. And then again, the one-stop shopping. Common excuses are, brewing's, it's not a very profitable space. Perhaps not in the distribution world, and John will couch some of this as well, but particularly when you're dealing with producers that are just over the bar. So they're just selling the stuff that they make at their own location. Those margins have much more room for them to integrate higher priced but more purposefully produced ingredients. And so I would venture to say that those are more of the customers that folks like I would be looking for. Questionable grain quality. Well, nobody can make the grain if you're not can grow grain if you're not in the Midwest. That's no longer true. It's inconvenient, perhaps, based on the fact that I'm not distributed through those particular distributors. But I find it to be relatively convenient to order from us. We're pretty quick. When you order from us, you're talking to me. And so you also removed a lot of the BS that can happen through habitual ordering. Undependable supply. You can't grow grain over here. It's so wet and rainy. We've had just fine harvests the last 3 years. I don't know if anybody's read about the drought in Canada and the horrendously low test weight and high protein out west. It would appear to me that that the breadbasket of the world is actually having a much harder time doing this than the Mid-Atlantic is at the moment. And then poor first impressions. Just keep in mind, these are peer-driven industries. So as much as I can go out and sell, it's much better off if you can make a good first impression and really manage reputation. Brewers talk to their friends. If you get one, you will probably get the other 10 that they talk to. And so if you can manage that impression side. In terms of market potential, so where folks should be looking if they're trying to access this market to diversify a little bit. There's malted grain, yes, but there's also raw grain in brewing and distilling, very much so in Virginia distilling. The advent of synthetic enzymes have really opened up the marketability of raw grain being turned into fermentable ingredients. You're not just looking at brewing, you can also be looking at distilling and obviously baking. You really need to focus on the fact that you are not a commodity brand. And so if you think of yourself as more of a luxury mindset, yes, you have to deliver on that mindset, but it also allows you to not have to have these, price negotiation conversations that you don't want to have with your customers. If you want cheap jeans, buy Wranglers. If you don't, buy Mobby jeans. I mean, I remember when I first went into a department store and saw $100 jeans. I couldn't believe it. I may or may not now wear those. But also keep in mind, you're going to be working with fewer, but they're going to be much, much more genuine customer relationships. So this is not a numbers game. This is a quality of supplier-customer relationships that you're really focused on. Did I make up the time there?
I think we're good. Time is now.
Indeed.
You can just race through it, I think.
Okay.
Right? It's kind of an extension of what you're just talking about.
Sure. So there's been a move. I feel like post-pandemic is kind of getting tiring at this point, but there's a transition moment during the pandemic where it became very obvious that people didn't have the dispensable income that they used to. So if they're going to spend money on a luxury, they're going to spend money on a luxury, and buying crap was no longer a passable decision to make. And so there became this mentality that a brewery is not just a brewery, is not just a brewery anymore, or a distillery. We need to differentiate between all of these places. When I opened Murphy and Rood Malting, I made one single bet, and that was the bet that eventually the brewing market would saturate further than it already had felt like it was. And at some point, you're going to run out of how many combinations you can hop an IPA with. So, assuming that there's an infinite way, a definite number of ways you can combine different hops in an IPA, at some point, if these breweries keep opening and keep opening and keep opening, eventually they're going to have to start differentiating themselves by the ingredients they use. Not just that their hazy IPA has Simcoe and Galaxy and Nectaron and Mosaic. And so you're making a long-term bet on the differentiation, and I think we saw that in 2019, 2020 is when the differentiation became kind of front page urgency, right? And so what are people choosing? They're choosing the strongest brand. So I certainly consider Wheatland to be one of these. The clearest value, the clearest ethos in their business. So they are here, they exist for these particular reasons. They're the most engaging consumer experience, so they storytell, they talk about what they're doing, they talk about how their beer is made, they celebrate their suppliers, they celebrate how this stuff is made. There's purpose over profit. Yes, we all need to profit enough to build a war chest so we can keep our businesses going, but it's not so much about how many tap rooms or how many satellite locations can we build and how big can we get. It's like the Uber phenomenon. I mean, you just keep going and going and going. You want to take over the UK and you want to take over China. Eventually, you become a disaster company that forgets kind of what's going on in the background, right? And then they have to remain committed to all of the things above. And then also, so we've talked about strongest. So now reputable. So quality. This is really not that hard if you have a basic bar of quality that you adhere to. And so as suppliers in that space, we can relate to our potential customers in that way. And the fact that we prioritize quality so that they can continue to prioritize quality. Again, more storytelling, less trend setting. I get it. I freaked out when seltzer hit the market. I really thought it was the end of my business. I'm really not kidding. My dad called, he's like, "What are you gonna do?" And I'm like, well, I guess we're gonna have to start talking about, seltzer becoming malt-based, and that's gonna be a tough market to sled in. And so we're gonna see these trends constantly, but we have to focus on the core market that we're working with. There's always going to be cool new stuff happening in the outset. That's the producer's job, is to keep people interested. We need to keep them sustained, right, with quality stuff. And then community appreciation. I'll touch on this a little further, but find businesses that inspire you. So as a supplier, Wheatland inspires me. right? Spear Lab Distilling in Charlottesville, Yvar inspires me. The way that they work and the way they believe in their businesses. If you can connect with those people, your customer target list has gone way down. It's not as overwhelming, but it's a much, much higher lead conversion rate here. You're talking to people that share your values, and so you're not swimming upstream nearly as much. If you're going to Aslan and say, hey, can I get into the Pittsburgh brewery, which is still wild to me. So if they appreciate their customers, and the customers appreciate them, it's very likely their suppliers are kind of held in the same realm. This might be
we got 20 minutes left. Maybe we just skip a couple of these.
Yeah, so I've touched on this in terms of like curating customers.
We've already touched on
Yeah, so just 2 quick points. Commodities, they went up in price. So it was a huge score for me. We had price parity in the malt market. All of a sudden, Weyermann malt coming out of Germany landed in the US was like 95 cents. I could work with 95 cents at a high volume standpoint. And so now all of a sudden we're playing in the same pool. I might be on one side and they might be on the other, but we're in the same pool. And so we can now work within the commodity space and diversify and differentiate and not be so far off on the pricing world that these are awkward conversations. They're going to fluctuate. It's a commodity market, but I don't think they're going to return to the basement prices that they would. They have come down a bit.
One thing on this I want to mention. Yeah. So on the opposite side of this, the fragile supply chain is a moderated supply chain. And a couple of years ago, when all the news was coming out about the terrible harvest out west and north, I just gave Jeff a quick call and I said, hey, do I need to buy futures here? How do I secure what I usually buy from you anyway? And what's the price going to be? And it was a pretty quick call. He said, oh, there's no change. You're all good. I said, okay, great. Have a good one. That was the extent of the conversation. A lot of different places were calling up their suppliers having to buy futures for commodity malt, having to secure those supplies. Prices didn't change, supply didn't change, everything was consistent, and we just went about our business. I think that's a pretty incredible thing when you not only get the highest quality ingredients, but you also get the consistency and the reliability, and you get someone you can actually talk to on the phone about what's going on. They're going to give you it straight. So it's a big difference.
And in the pricing world, stick to your guns. I mean, I opened at a shocking price, $1.10 per pound for base malt. Like that's in some cases in silo malt, that's like 3 times or quadruple the price. Then you're not my customer, right? So you have this mentality of I'm not trying to solve all of the world's problems, and particularly yours if you're looking for that pricing malt. But if you stick to your guns, while yes, I took a little bit of a haircut during the pandemic in terms of operating and overhead costs, I didn't have to change my pricing because I hadn't sold myself down into the basement already, and so I didn't have to crawl back out of it. So if you stick to your guns and you charge what it costs, you will, trust me, find customers that can understand that things cost what they cost. Not everybody will because you have cheaper options, but it is, I think, a lesson in sustainability in these businesses is that you really can't get into the game of this race to the bottom stuff. It dilutes the entire point that you're trying to make in more than one way, and so stay where you need to be.
If I can here, since we got about 15 minutes for the session, before we get into these kind of weeds a little bit, or hopefully no weeds if you're growing barley.
Hey!
Does anyone have any questions so far about what's been discussed yet? Right on.
How much space is there for additional malting businesses or industries? I mean, it sounds like you are solely tied to their...
We use 2 maltsters.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that provide essentially similar value in terms of the type of malt you want.
I would say they offer differentiated value. but similar enough. They're 2 craft maltsters. We only use craft malt. We have a couple projects every year where we get grain from elsewhere, either on the East Coast or from Germany. It's a farm we used to visit when we lived there, so we have a special emotional tie to it, but that's for our fest beer and one other one. Everything else comes from our Piedmont growing region, so that's Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. But that's our choice to do that.
And I mean, I'm the first dedicated commercial malt house in Virginia. I am still the only one. I don't know if that's because, I'm just unbeatable at the business game, or if people just think I'm completely batshit crazy.
Could it be both?
And it could be both. But so most certainly, I mean, I could give you graphs that would, that our production capacity in Virginia, the line doesn't even show up on the graph when you look at the malt usage market, just within the Mid-Atlantic. And that's keeping out all of the big guys, the dogfish heads of the world. Removing those folks, the production bar is not visible on that graph.
Anybody else? All right. I'll talk briefly on this. So for years, we've been on these calls where people have told us that it's impossible to grow healthy, vibrant small grains in the Mid-Atlantic. You just can't do it. Grains can only grow in certain places, and it's not here. After a half a decade of doing this myself, it turns out you can grow small grains here. It is very possible. Our approach is a little different. Like I said before, we don't use chemicals, so makes it a little bit more challenging, more expensive to start, but that's how we've decided to go about this. What's exciting is that Virginia Tech is the largest malting barley breeder east of the Mississippi, and they've done a fantastic job getting new cultivars out, almost too many new cultivars out. But they have a new one, Avalon, which we've had in our fields, and it's grown very well. But they also have a lot of other stuff coming up. They have interesting wheat coming up. Most of the wheat that's used in beer anywhere in the world is made for bread. It's not made for beer. So the protein levels and other factors within the grains themselves that are important for the malting and brewing process are not optimized for malting and brewing. We just have to kind of deal with that. But if you grow your own grain for your beer, you can put whatever grain you want in the ground. And so that's what we've done. So Virginia Tech has some really interesting stuff coming out. We happen to live in a place where the soil is of outstanding quality. We have a nice roll to the land, so it never gets too soupy, and we have a good wind that comes, so we don't get a lot of the mold and fungus pressure that sometimes accompany other places. So that's a consideration as you're looking at land. You were talking about growing barley. There was someone else talking about growing barley. No? Just want to learn more. Okay. But these are all considerations, and kind of you got it or you don't in the environment. You have good soil or you don't. You can always work to improve it. You can always put amendments in and do these sorts of things, but it sure is helpful when it's good from the start.
So this is us speaking to the fact that from a grower perspective, growing grain for craft beverage in this part of the country is no longer this test market, you think you can pull it off, we're not so sure. I entered the industry when all of the grain growers in Virginia were reeling from the Osage biofuel plant bankruptcy, and so they had contracted all of this barley and all of this corn acreage to Osage. Osage took delivery and all of that and then went bankrupt. So they had they gave all of this grain to the biofuel plant, but then never got paid for it. Purdue Agri-Services came in and bought all of it up for the chicken side of things, which frankly probably saved my ability to ask a farmer to grow 30 acres of barley for me as opposed to corn or soybeans for export. And so the fact is that when I went looking for growers back in 2012, 2013, I was approaching them saying, would you be willing, pretty please, just a little bit. Whereas now their growers are coming to us. I mean, there's this need to diversify on-farm crop selection, so they're looking to, hedge a little bit on corn and soybean futures based on just trade war shit that happened a couple years ago, and so we are a viable option, but we are not this unknown option anymore. It's been we've had enough years at this point where we have annual data that would suggest that this is not as risky or scary or undefined as it used to be.
And I think, just to jump in there real quick, I think this ties into what we were talking about before about stabilizing and the local producers and the local economy actually acting as a stabilizer. When you don't have these commodity markets, when you're not buying futures or swaps for soy or these other things in global markets that can swing wildly based on things that are totally out of your control, that's not the case when you know the farmers down the road from you. You can have those direct one-on-one relationships. It changes the dynamics and the mechanics of it considerably. Jeff will know throughout the season how my crop is doing because I'll be texting him crying about how bad the crop is or expressive of how great the crop is. Same with all of his farmers. So there's no surprises at the end of the season when it does or doesn't work out. And this is I think this is a stabilizing impact on this, which is so different from the commodity markets where it's just a different animal completely. And you don't have those one-on-ones with a lot of the farmers. Yes, sir.
I have a question you may not be able to answer.
Okay.
Or you maybe can. If you're starting from ground zero, and we're taking your initial numbers of 120 tons a year, correct?
Of malt production, sure.
Malt production. What's the capital cost of throwing out malt house?
Oh, a bigger malt house?
Well, I mean, just what's the capital cost of doing the smaller one?
Oh, so that was just short of $500,000. So I'm asking investors to take a bet on something that, number one, they don't understand. So they have no idea what malt is. I mean, this is not just in the investor world. Most people don't realize that grain is involved in beer production, which is terrifying. But so we're starting from an unknown place, and so the capital costs of malting is the number one barrier to entry. That is also why in some days I tell myself that next time we grow, it's like we're done with the duct tape, right? So like we're not going to duct tape this place together anymore. Because I built a place that actually I'm very proud of how long it has lasted. To be completely honest with you, I mean I still am using all of the original equipment. We've added some, but that is the difficulty of entering the market, is that there's two ways to do it. You can either go big and build a warship that is much bigger but is betting on higher returns down the road, or you can start small like me and say, I just hope I can sell 120 tons this year. And what we have seen in the craft malting world as of recent is that the big ones are the ones that have failed. So the 1886s of the world and Skagit, which is heartbreaking, and Washington State, these were 30, 40, $50 million malt houses. So it's not necessarily that you're building this field of dreams and they will come. I have come to peace with the fact that we will build Murphy and Rood relatively organically, not necessarily to say that we're just going to build it as we can afford it. We're going to build it as our demand dictates.
Well, the reason all your stuff still works is because it's called force of will. It will not give up.
That is very true.
All right, so are you taking brick and mortar into your $500,000? Are you taking
No,
development?
no, I rent my
Okay,
place,
that's just equipment.
which also hurts. Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay.
I hate the rental market. I don't know about you guys.
I'm sorry, just to clarify, you're saying that the $500,000 is for equipment to, in the malt house rather than actually constructing the superstructure? I'm totally.
Yeah, so I mean, I rented a 6,000 square foot building.
Oh, you were in the building, okay, and then you put the.
And then I put
$500,000
$500,000 worth of shit in there,
Yes, yes, okay.
How many employees
That makes
do you
sense.
have? How many employees do you have to run that facility?
So I have 2 guys. And it used to be me by myself.
Yeah.
That was a year of like walking pneumonia and not seeing new babies. But, I hired one guy, he was like a different world. And then I hired a second guy and it was amazing. And we're running at full bore. We're gonna hire a third at the turn of the year. And that to me, from a production standpoint, is all I would need, regardless really of our size at this point. It changes a bit if you change the intensity of your production. So if you go to like 24-hour production, which is what the big guys obviously do, that certainly changes your human capital investments. But we structure our production to operate during the
I need
day.
to be asking so many questions. Do you guys have a contractual relationship?
No. I mean, if there's
Probably should.
there's
I don't trust him.
There's a text. There's a text chain that probably will never. It's probably taking up an entire.
No, but
Cloud
I
storage
think
facility,
more
right?
important than any contract is trust that you have with some other person. And so we've been working together long enough. We know each other well enough. I would argue that that's stronger than any piece of paper.
Well, it just would
signed.
give him the security of knowing that he's gonna sell X amount to you every year.
He already knows it.
Yeah, and yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna ask, I'm sorry, I was out of room for minutes, but you don't talk about exactly where your barley is grown in terms of Virginia, Maryland, whatever.
Well, for me, so we are all Virginia grown at this point. We're not
In the neighborhoods.
corporately like
Yeah.
glued to that. We would need to go outside of Virginia for Mother Nature reasons, but we're all Virginia grown because that provides what we need.
Well, one of the reasons I asked is because, Montgomery County, Maryland, right across the river, has a 90,000 acre agricultural reserve, which has been sitting there now for 43 years, growing horses and commodity corn and soybeans, And it's kind of locked in that, and people have been trying to break in on the side of it, but my God, what a resource that would be if somehow it could be doing the kind of things that you all need, for example. And I don't know whether Virginia has any similar kind of space out there. I mean, I'm pretty familiar with Northern Virginia, but I don't know whether the availability of farmland and its expense, I mean, I know it's part of the equation, of course it's part of the equation. I mean, that's the reason why these guys are still doing commodity horses and grain, out there, is because it pays the bills.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that our problem right now is that we're not big enough from a agricultural standpoint.
You mean your demand?
No, well, just my production, my demand. I feel like I will always be chasing my tail on demand. So like we expanded in January, and that has, evaporated into nothing, and we're back to back orders and out of stocks. But it has a lot more to do with, I don't have a problem getting the acreage commitments from growers, so I contract my grain every year. And when I say contract, I say like, hey, can you grow 30 acres? They say, yeah. I'm like, cool. I introduced a formal contract to a grower, and it like torpedoed the entire thing. I've done much better without a contract, and frankly, starting out, my growers were like, I would just rather stick with a handshake. Like, we don't need to sign anything. Like, you don't screw me, I won't screw you. I think we'll be just fine. And we've functioned on that basis since the beginning. Going back to what was talked about in the opening session, we just have an infrastructure problem.
Yeah.
My biggest problem is I can't take bulk grain deliveries, and so I have to get grain in a super sack, in a truck, on a flatbed. I would love to build a grain cleaning facility and grain intake next to my malt house. I have a great location for it. I think it took me 15 minutes of budgetary work to get to like $2.5, $3 million just just to be able to run the amount of grain that I need on a given year. This is just very expensive stuff. And so we've pivoted. We put a 900 bushel bin on one of our growers' properties. And so we are now partnering with our growers to slowly kind of build infrastructure, as opposed to, then we have like this Anne Arundel thing, what I would love to learn more about, the Southwest Virginia terminal. These are very game-changing things for
Right. And just to, I guess maybe I should approach this question from the other end then, and you kind of answered it, but it doesn't seem like the problem is lack of land that can be farmed for you guys and for a lot of other guys, a lot of other companies. That doesn't seem to be the problem, lack of land, lack of arable,
Yeah, no, and so, really it's we're competing with mills that do have infrastructure, right? Like growers love filling bulk dump trailers and taking it to the mill and coming back home.
Right.
It's just the convenience of it all, and I understand completely, and I want to get there. But those are where the massive investments are. My Madison County grower, we've gone up 20 acres every year.
Yeah.
I think he would keep going till eternity with it. Just like, okay, do you want to go like 100 this year? Like 120? You want to be grossing 6
I haven't
for
talked
you?
to the brewers over in Montgomery County. There are a couple of them. I don't know where they're getting their stuff and whether it's cost effective. Maybe they're going out further west of Maryland, or I don't know, wherever. But I guess the supply is not really the issue.
No, and I have the opposite concern. I have the concern that growers are going to be like, this is too much of a lift for not enough acres, and I'm going to start losing them because they want to make bigger moves, and I won't be able to service the move. Production-wise, not so much. Taking delivery, yes. I mean,
One thing though you brought up, and maybe this gets back to the contract issue you were talking about. There's a brewery over in Belgium who, about the same time we started doing this, they have a cereal collective that they have over there, trying to bring heirlooms back to Belgium, farmhouse brewing. And one of the linchpins for their approach is sharing the risk with farmers. And so it's 50 cents on the dollar for whatever acre they grow. Whether it succeeds or not, they're at least going to give them 50 cents on the dollar. And so there's ways to hedge those future risks for those farmers that incentivizes them to make sure they're growing that stuff. And so they found that to be really helpful because it also builds trust with them. It shows them that you have skin in the game and you're willing to risk your own money on this thing too.
Yeah, I mean, the handshake and all that, I mean, small is beautiful and all the rest of that. I mean, that makes sense. And wouldn't we all love to do that? But it's just from our point of view with an elevator that has a 10 bushel capacity, and we're searching for things to do. What you're just talking about, to me, is a $2 million project. So $500,000 for equipment and whatnot, operating expenses, got to move a building, yada, yada, yada. It's a $2 million expense. If I go to grantors or even better, government agencies and lay this out for them, what they're going to come back to me for is we want to see the proof.
Right.
We want to see the people that are going to use this, supply it, what are the numbers behind it. And that's not easy. Not at this sort of nascent, beginning to it. I think we all agree it's a good idea. You got to convince the people that.
Absolutely, and I come from the perspective of and it would be for this just like it is for Southwest Virginia. If you need, knowing how these things work, having built a malt house and asking for funding and so on and so forth, I have no problem making commitments, right? Like I know how much I produce a year, I know how much I can move, I know how much more I'm going to be producing next year, so on and so forth. It's, I have always been completely and totally fine with contracts from a security standpoint of just like knowing that you've got things. It just happens to be that none of the growers I work with are really into like the paperwork, right? And so, but for me, knowing that it would take those commitments to these projects to build that infrastructure, I am more than happy to make this.
Okay, a couple quick questions for you guys. You talked about soil composition on the farm. Do you guys do any composting?
Depends how you define it. We take all the biomass from the cover crops and turn it back in.
Okay, so like green composting type thing. I was just thinking because like where we are in Anne Arundel County, it's notoriously, from what I understand, not great soil. So I
Okay.
feel like I'm gonna have to condition it in some
Yeah.
ways. From the malting perspective, can you guys do a lot of varieties of kind of like toasts and stuff like that? Because one of the things I'm finding with local maltsters is that I can get base
couple
malts
things, yeah.
and a couple other, like maybe a chocolate malt.
Yeah.
But I can't get like smokes and stuff like that. And I'm in the whiskey game where I need that type of stuff.
Yeah, so I mean, we currently have 33 products.
Okay.
And that's all went to the specialty malt decision I had made. So we invested in a more capable kiln. We invested in a drum roaster, and so it opened my capabilities way up, because a lot of craft maltsters, when they open, they're like, okay, I'm just gonna like stick to what I can pull off here. And oftentimes that's just like 2 or 3 base malts, because it's volume, it allows them to move more at once. I just kind of reverse engineered that. And so I was more coming from the standpoint of like, I need to be able to stretch this very limited capacity that I have further, not so much as I need to sell it all at once. Like frankly, like that to me is the death of a small business, is out of stocks and back orders. And I almost proved it, but that is a much bigger problem than viewing it from the standpoint of how am I going to maximize the capacity that I can get versus like how big of pallets can I sell this in one invoice for.
And then on seed cleaning, you had said it didn't look like it was a viable thing for you to do. My small seed cleaner is actually here in another room right now. I talked to him earlier. He can do 10,000 pounds in a couple hours. Is that a lot, or is that?
It's like five tons. I mean, that's fair. Like,
Okay. I just didn't know like the scale of what I was looking at when I was.
No, I mean that's pretty good. I mean, it has a lot more to do with like what you're cleaning and how bad it is and what you're trying to get out of it, of how long it takes. I mean, last week we cleaned 6 tons in a morning, and the next day we cleaned 1 tote in like 5 hours.
Okay.
Because it had to run very slow because it had all sorts of stuff in it, but it's very clean now. But what you're putting in kind of dictates how long it's going to take to get it out. And trust me, like at the cleaning side of things, like these things will pay for themselves. It's the upfront investments. I mean, cleaning as a service, like my grower, I have essentially gotten my grower into the cleaning for a service, number one for me. But then also we put a bin on, he can take bulk grain from other growers of mine, clean it for me and bring it to me, and he gets paid for that. There's such a shortage of that infrastructure. There's no doubt that we would be able to return the investment. It is the like, you want $3 million for what? Discussion. It's what's a gravity table? Yeah.
Can I talk about pricing of beer retail?
Sure.
Just because you're here, yeah. I mean, there's still, despite there being a shakeout in the industry that you're talking about, there's still, of course, lots of craft folks out there doing things, and I see them in Whole Foods, I try to always look for the one that's not $17 for a 6-pack, which, I mean, more local you get, the higher the price goes, it seems. Like the local DC brewers can get up to $16, $17. Do you think that's a honest reflection of costs, and or is it more market and consumer oriented to what you can charge and basically expect for people to pay? Because how do you look at it? Because you're out there in Loudon, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're selling to mostly local retailers.
We do select distro.
Yeah.
So because our approach is pretty unusual,
Yeah.
and our approach is exorbitantly expensive.
Yeah.
We We go to, we're not in grocery stores.
Oh, you're not?
We're in bottle shops and
Yeah.
specialty bars
Yeah.
and places like that. As far as other breweries and what they charge, you'd have to ask them if it's fair. I don't know.
Yeah.
For us, we're on the higher end of the scale. But once people understand what goes into it, our ingredient costs are 3-4 times just on the grain that most breweries are. Our beers take 2, sometimes 3 times as long in tank versus other places. We don't filter beer. We let it mature in tank. All those things have a cost, and so we try to include that. But once people understand what goes into our beer and they taste it, there's usually a light bulb that says, like, this is actually a pretty good value, which we agree with.
And you're not downing 6 of them at a time, so
Yeah,
you don't have to spend $100.
Yeah, so I think it's I think there's a few different things at play in retail, and that's kind of that's a longer conversation about pricing in retail. It's a whole different animal.
But you sell at your brewery, right?
We sure do.
And you have a tap room type situation?
Yeah. But maybe the question behind the question you're asking here is, are those prices warranted, and are they sustainable for those places? I guess the market's going to let us know pretty soon.
Right. They're all over the place, you know.
Yeah,
It's really hard
they
to-
are, and you have a pretty good sense of what goes into other beers just because you know the ingredients and you can kind of guess about what it might cost. But it's tricky though because we'll see our beers. You know, if one of our 4-packs is $19, and we see another 4-pack for $19.
Why change? Or
For us, it's
So
one
why
of
is
these.
yours $19?
Yeah.
We know why ours is $19.
Yeah, so that's the kind of thing I scratch my head a little bit because I know our ingredient costs are very expensive. But that's a decision we made because we still want the beer to be accessible to people. We still want people to have that experience and come out to the farm and enjoy it on site.
Are your profits mostly coming from your tap room and your on-site, or do you have a real good mixture of both?
It depends.
Yeah.
It's seasonal. So we try to encourage people to come out to the farm because that's, in our estimation, that's the best way to experience the brand, the product. You can see the barley fields from the beer garden.
I'm going to visit. I'm ready to go.
Well, please do.
Yeah.
Please do. We have a B&B there on the property too, so if you want to book a night. But it's tough because the market is saturated. There's no question about it. And in Loudon, I mean, the land itself is very expensive, and we have a lot of breweries now, and so you're competing for dollars, and so it creates interesting market dynamics.
I would add to that though, like something that I've been seeing even, I was one of not doing nights and I was going to a week at a brewery. And a lot of folks, you're talking about like where people are going like post-pandemic with their money, and they do want to spend their money on quality and on an experience. And so when breweries are focusing on like producing a product at a time and place, that has a story behind it. And that's how you get folks to engage and come out. And so then it's like, that $19 is because like I went, I experienced a moment, a time, I tasted a place, and I'm taking that home with me.
That's right.
Bingo.
Yep.
One of the most, I thought, great ideas you guys had at Wheatland was to put the farmers market on there on the weekends.
Oh yeah.
Which I lived 13 years in Asheville, and none of those breweries ever combined. I mean, it's very strong farmers market community there, and a very strong brewery community, but neither of the two ever combined forces. And I mean, I don't know if it's a huge game changer for it, but I just think it's a great way to kind of bring two very commonly held the consumers that are seeking one are seeking the other, and bring them together. And there's probably more versions of that out there to experiment with.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. We did it because we wanted to support small producers. Everyone at our farmers market is a grower and or a maker. And so it's not always easy for those folks to have an avenue to sell to people, or they have to pay someone in order to have that access. So it's not a column in our business unit profit driver Excel sheet. It's nothing like that. We do it because we want to do it. And so it's meaningful for us. Appreciate that.
I mean, and it also helps to connect the dots. And so people come onto that property and see that there's a farmer's market here. Like, why is there a farmer's market here? Like, is there a particular so like then they start to pick up the concept that these are agricultural value-added products that are going to market, right? And so it's all related, and you know, I would venture to say that the Asheville phenomenon is because people perhaps wouldn't think that they're similar, right? Which is part of the problem. Is like you kind of need to change that basic understanding.
That's the education we go through every time, every one of our cans, every one of our bottles, every conversation we have on the menu at our farm. It's implicitly or explicitly highlighting that beer is an agricultural product, and it can be from a time and a place. Most oftentimes it's not in 2023, but it can be. And helping tell that story overtly or covertly is a 24/7 gig. It just doesn't stop. I mean, we still have people with barley in the field ask what that is, and we say it's barley. They're like, "Oh, does that go in beer?" It's like, yes, it does.
Yo, Chris.
Yes. So speaking to that about like the untraining people from viewing beer as a commodified product, right? I mean, it's in some ways it's a perfectly logical thing to do because it's only relatively recently that we're moving away from that. Even craft breweries now are still using this commodified grade, so linking it with other products that have found a way to get people to recognize the difference and pay for the difference. Like farmers markets and local produce angles, lines, you're starting to see people understand the differentiation between small producers and commodity wine, right? You're big, terrible, shiners and stuff like that. So I feel like that's an avenue that it's still coming along, and I think the price tolerance element, talking about the cost per unit, I mean, it's still the most affordable beverage per unit, right? If you think about, you go to a bar and it's a $7 pint or a $12 glass of wine or a $15 cocktail, and like maybe that doesn't really reflect the costs that go into it. That's only part of pricing, but I feel like getting consumers to appreciate whether it's ingredient costs or if there's other value that having a higher ceiling for what beer can be, and moving away from this race to the bottom, which no small producer has ever won that battle.
That's right.
I actually have a question though that's away from that. If I had $3 million and I don't, and I wanted to spend it somewhere in the value chain that wasn't you all, something to make life a little bit easier for you to fill the gap. What would it be? A logistics company? Would it be grain handling or cleaning? Would it be storage, or where would
For me, the infrastructure. It's the stuff that we've been talking about. It's
I was gonna
infrastructure.
say it's 3 million. Is that the number?
Is that it? Is that all you got?
I'm just.
Yeah, I'd say I know for us, once we take it off the field, it's like a Rube Goldberg device, trying to get everything to work out for a finite period of time. It is super stressful until we can get the train over to Jeff's. But infrastructure, it's the least interesting topic, but it is the most important.
Yeah, that's why nobody wants to do it.
Yeah.
They're excited about, I now have this, cool box that I get.
And the thing is, you can co-locate this stuff. Like, it's not just for one farm, it's for multiple farms, and you can bring all the stuff together, and it costs less when you have it co-located, like an elevator. It's just, it takes someone or entities to come together to decide that that's what they want to do, and they want to place a bet on that, or they want to invest in the community and see the long-term benefit of it. But it's not as interesting as a tech startup and, selling apps.
Do you have a question?
Yeah. Jeff, you mentioned that growers are starting to come to you,
Mhm.
and that some of those are folks who are growing traditional corn and soy, and they're interested in transitioning some of their acres
Yeah.
to grades. What has that looked like for them and for you?
Well, so what does it look like? I think it's it's a good question. I think it's been, I think there's a reason my Madison County grower keeps coming back to me. So he was one of those. So he kind of cold called me, asking if I needed any additional acreage, and I kind of didn't at the time, but there's this need to like constantly cultivate my farmer network. I never know if somebody's going to change their farm strategy at any given point, so I kind of always need to keep some warm bodies around. I think there's a reason why they keep coming back and looking for more acreage. Frankly, I think it is also just incredibly enjoyable for them. I think the corn and soybean churn just gets a little monotonous, and Ted's an agronomist by trade, and so he loves thinking about growing grain and how to fix protein and fix soil, and so I think when they get paid the price that they need to grow it, it gives them some producer belief. Like I said, I mean, I'm paying my growers not to grow corn and soybeans. It's like I don't pay growers the market price for barley. I pay them not to grow wheat or not to grow corn or not to grow. I'm like, would you please, replace that with this? And so they're not giving up a price point to grow something else because I'm paying them not to grow the other thing, and so my price is higher. The infrastructure thing then becomes a problem because they're like, well, is this like bin run? I'm like, not even close. No, like it needs to be cleaned, it needs to be put in a tote, it needs to be loaded on a truck. Now, we'll pay shipping, but there's added steps to it, right? And whereas if we could add the convenience of infrastructure, I think that would open up probably a whole handful of other growers. I mean, I've had multiple conversations where they're like, yeah, but you need it packaged, right? Like in bulk totes. I'm like, yeah. They're like, yeah. So like, if you can solve the grower convenience issue with infrastructure, your network opens up to an exponentially larger pool, I think. But so far, so good. Nobody's been like, dude, this was like total bullshit you were talking about. Like, this is a total boon for you, but not for me. And I mean, we've never had that situation. We've had growers come and go based on how their crop went in a given year. I mean, I've had my first grower, Dan Brand in Christiansburg, come and go, I think 2 or 3 times now. So some years he just needs to like focus on pumpkins or wheat. And then if he has a good year, he'll come back. But his entire crop, both his wheat and his barley, sprout damage this year. So he's off again, right? So I've lost him for a year, not because he doesn't believe in barley, but because he ate crow this year, right? And so he needs to recoup that somehow. And so, but that that was his milling wheat too, right? So it wasn't all just our stuff. I mean, pumpkins can fail too, right? It's just you're going to have these natural ebb and flows of your grower network that you need to just come to terms with.
I think we're over time, so if anyone needs a split, we're still here if you want to ask questions. That's fine too. Oh, it's 12:30?
Yeah.
Oh, my bad. I thought it was 12. Then we're good.
What happens in circumstances where maybe there is major crop loss in the season, and you have people in their own supply chain who have built a business model around 100% local sourcing?
So you're talking about, sorry, is that for John?
Both of you.
Okay.
Yeah, like what would you do if
that's the good
he doesn't have something, and what do you do if the farmers can't provide?
So I work with another maltster. Between the two of them, chances are one of them has the thing I'm looking for, and if it doesn't, then I don't make that beer.
Yeah, and then what if the estate crop fails?
It's going to fail. That's one guarantee you have in farming, is that it's going to fail at some point. I look at beer as an agricultural product. It's an extension of the farming. I expect things not to go as planned, and I bake that into our philosophy in brewing. So if I need spelt, and Jeff doesn't have it this year, and my other maltster doesn't have it, then I don't make that beer with spelt. I figure out something else, which to me is a more realistic and natural expression of agriculture to make do with what you have in the moment versus calling in some rescue from halfway across the world to make something. I think it has more, it keeps the identity and it makes it actually a more honest interpretation of what we're trying to do. We just kind of roll with it.
Before you answer, I have a follow-up question. So your commitment is primarily to local grain, right? Because you said the hops are not something available in your growing region.
We do use some local hops,
Some
yeah,
local
but
hops.
there's not a lot.
Do you bring in hops from, the Pacific Northwest and
Sure.
other places?
Yep.
Have you thought about just not using hops?
Yeah, in some beers we don't.
Okay.
Yep. The challenge there is that we can dream up all these recipes and things that I might like to drink or Jeff might like to drink, but if enough people don't like to drink it, then we can't make beer anymore. So it's a balance, right? So
Yeah.
there are certain styles that I gravitate toward, or maybe Jeff gravitates toward, and if those Venn diagram circles align with what the general public wants to consume, then we're great. But some of the more esoteric styles that I might find interesting probably aren't going to be leading our sales category. So we have to take that into consideration. I just made a beer with a buddy of mine from Vermont that has a lot of different herbs in it, and it's pretty funky. And there's 6 people who are going to buy it, but I wanted to make it, and so we went ahead and made it.
Winter cover?
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So it hasn't been released yet, but it's one of these considerations. I kind of look at it like you have to make some romantic comedies in order to make the art noir films, right?
Yeah.
So we have to strike a balance because our model is so intentionally restrictive in how we source and how we approach beer. This is just one of these things. We don't make smoothie sours or some of these other kind of newer-ish styles. We do kind of have a red line that we don't cross, but we make IPAs. We make these other styles. We have to source the hops from somewhere else because Virginia and Maryland just don't produce them. If they did, I'd be very happy to source from there, but we just can't find the quality and the volume that we need.
So that'd be another place to put the 3 million.
Okay.
Is hop, number one, some very honest agronomic studies of hops in this region. I mean, I think it's, when we had, and I'm just gonna give you guys a look at the continuing slides because I don't need to read them to you, but I still would want you to see them, is that on the grain side, the agronomics were there, and then the value-added production came. In hops, they kind of flipped that. So they were more like, I got all this land, and I've got this, it loves sun, and it loves our climate. But there was no discussion of, okay, what varieties of hops are going to do the best here, and then what are you going to do when it needs to be harvested? And so that part was kind of we'll figure out that when we get there. And that's just unfortunately not the best route.
The University of Maryland, though, has made a lot of progress in that.
Yeah, and so
The monocacy, the hop you were just talking about, I didn't mention, but we have a hop garden, so that we just planted the bottom quarter of it, monocacy, so we'll see, which is the new varietal that the University of Maryland just developed.
and Virginia State University too, but it's kind of at least within the Virginia ecosystem, it was kind of the growers went to Virginia State University after.
And it takes time, so
it was in the wrong order.
This is just the first year that monocacy is even available to purchase to plant. So.
Yeah. Whereas I'm, going to field days when I'm doing this stuff in my basement, right? Because I'm trying to figure out what varieties are we going to plant here. Because there's no point in building a malt house if I don't have barley varieties that will succeed that I can, justifiably ask a farmer to grow. And so, if you got to think about it agronomically first, but then it becomes this first impression thing, So when there's not a lot of processing and infrastructure on the hop side, I think it makes it harder to sell hops because they just don't use a lot of whole cone fresh wet hops.
Yeah, the hops can be pretty
But
tricky. I'll say from
but once a
using
year.
local hops, we've used some that were pelletized, and I've experienced a difference between the whole cone is happy. We dry some of those. We use them. We do open fermentation, so they're great on the hot side, but it's not always consistent on the cold side if you want to dry hop or you want to do those sorts of things with, especially pelletized, because the equipment that you need to do that well and to keep the oxygen out and keep everything that you need out of there, small scale is really, really tricky to do.
It doesn't really exist.
What's that?
It doesn't really exist.
Yeah, I mean, Greenmont's got a bind picker, and it's like they're like the next coming of Christ. I mean, like everybody goes to them and be like, harvest our hop, or like pick our hops for us, and they, you know, it's like this like festival of hops in Greenmont, because pretty sure they're like one of the few that have a bind picking machine,
Yeah.
and that just gets the bind off the.
Yeah, that doesn't take care of the rest
It
of the
just
stuff.
gets the hop off the
Probably
bind.
the hop grower on the East Coast that has like the most infrastructure is probably 4-Star Farms up in New England, Massachusetts. They have a body picker, pelletizer. You know, they've expanded
Mm-hmm.
considerably over the last few years. We work with 100% locally sourced hops, except for some like here and there. And I will echo.
Sorry, where are you from?
Succession Fermentary.
Okay.
Southeast Pennsylvania.
Okay, great.
And I'll echo some of those like, you know, challenges of working with local hops where you're using almost exclusively whole cone. You know, that presents some challenges on dry hopping side, nucleation points, other things, but you know, and the variability too. But I think, you know, you said it earlier in your talk, part of it is like we're after that variability. We're after that kind of, this is a reflection of a time and a place and a soil profile and a microclimate and these other things. And so it would be really great if you had more local hops that you could turn to, because it
Would be great,
it
yeah.
really creates a unique expression in the finished product. It's something that's, you know, we used, when I was up in New England area, we used nugget from 4-Star Farms, and the profile on that was almost like citro, right? Because of the microclimate influence on that particular hop varietal. So even like experimenting on your own farm, growing some cool, you know, there's enough precedent too to know like what will actually grow well in our.
Now there is, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Cascade
there's so much fungal and
grow
disease
well.
pressure. And,
Yeah.
you know, there's
That's the
a
problem
good
though. So
reach in.
we would have to spray then on our farm to get them to actually grow well.
Yeah, so like one of the hop growers that we work with on Hill Hop Yard, you know, they're totally organic, so all their sprays are just like, you know, copper based or whatever. And they do have a regimen and they have a program involved in that, but their product is spectacular. And we love working with it. A lot of other people do too. And they're at the point now where everything is pre-sold before the harvest even happens. So they're usually sold out and like first come, first serve. It's pretty wild.
And they do have the processing ability, or no? Do
They
they
hand pick, which is really amazing.
Yeah.
They hand pick and hand process, and they have all these crazy drying racks and stuff. Another grower that we work with, Murphy's Hop Yard, they have a little more infrastructure. You know, they got a vine picker, I believe, and you know, that's allowed them to increase their scale. You know, that's the infrastructure is what allows you to scale and to do things with certain efficiencies. But
Yeah, and I mean that I think that's a great example of, if you can start, even if you start small, if you can get the basic, if you can take care of the basic priorities of getting what you are producing from field to market,
yeah.
you know, you don't necessarily need to invest $3 million to do it, but if you can identify what do we need to do to be able to like inspire confidence in the market with this, that is going to get you much, much further, I think. And I'm speaking of like the brewing world. I just think it, you know, they can be a bit of, you know, a little judgy sometimes, and somewhat fickle, and that, you know, if it doesn't work, then we're not going to talk again, right? And so if you can overcome that barrier right out of the gate, build up a little trust, then it's the scaling thing can come after. It's the you know, not really identifying just the basic requirements of getting things to the quality standard that folks need. It kind of slows the ability to move in the right direction. Is the, you know, you cannot make a second first impression. It's just tough. So I think we are officially done now. But so I think this was just the these are the last couple slides. But. And then just to answer your question about what if a crop fails on my end, we do absolutely, and I mean like exhaustively so, try to find ways to move that for our grower. So like I will pound the pavement in terms of based on what the harvest issue was. I mean, there's been times where it just had a ton of volunteer wheat in it. It was fine, but it's like this 50-50 mix of barley and wheat. Like I can't sell that to a brewer necessarily, but the distillers loved it. I mean, I had a local distiller that did a wheated bourbon, so I mean, it's like he just needed to put the one bag in instead of like 2 bags because it was already mixed. But you know, there's fodder systems coming online now that are phenomenal off market for sprout damaged grain. It just needs to germinate, which sprout damage will germinate. It just, you know, it's released itself amylase. It, you know, doesn't have the needs of what I am looking to produce, but for a fodder system, that's perfect, and they use a lot of volume. So if you can, we are constantly looking at ways that we can divert failed crops if we need to, because frankly, I need to keep these folks in the game, right? Like I do not have this endless supply of growers, and so me going like, sorry, can't take it, and then not offering any help in trying to, you know, recoup some of the costs there, is just kind of disingenuous to me. So I do absolutely everything I can. And even if you're not able to pull it off, the gesture of trying to do it frames you with your grower that, you know, you have, you know, a symbiotic relationship here. It's not a transaction necessarily.
Thank you all.